Charge your glasses, everyone, drinking deep that summer sun. Tastes so sweet it can't last long. When it's gone, it's gone. Caught a second in your gaze, feel the closeness of your face. Now's our moment to embrace.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yay, brilliant. Hello, welcome. Happy Celtic New Year. Thank you so much. It's so gorgeous to see so many of you. Yeah, really wonderful. And I'm super excited about this evening. Got two wonderful storytellers, Maria Gillen and Shona Cowie. Yay! Please, you two, feel free to chip in with anything that I miss in this kind of little intro. But yeah, I just had this idea of having a Celtic storytelling session, and I found these two wonderful storytellers at Zoom events, and I could gather them all together. So a few little bits of housekeeping. So it might be a nice idea for you to pop in the top right hand corner, you'll see a little box that says speak of you. If you want to see us, then it might be quite nice for you to activate that, or just switch us off completely and sit back and listen, whatever you prefer. Just a reminder to mute yourself throughout the first half, and just a little warning that we are going to be recording. We've kindly had sponsorship from the wonderful CARAD and Kerry Writers Museum, and so this event's kind of to use this event for some of their online material going forward. So unless we're recording on Speak of You, so you're quite safe. You won't be seen unless you speak. There will be an opportunity for you to speak in the second half. So that might be the time where you turn your camera off if you don't want to be seen. So we're going to run with a 45-minute for the first half. Then we'll have a little 15-minute break. And then in the second half, we're going to have a couple of stories from Shona and Maria, and we're actually going to throw the floor open as well to you guys. So if any of you have got a song or a little story that you want to share, then if you want to just send me a little private message, and then we'll slot you into the second half as well. It'd be really lovely to hear from you guys as well. What else do I need to know? Oh, just to say, I hope you've all got your candles lit as we bring a little bit of light and warmth from the summer into the winter months, and just to remind you to have your stone nearby, whatever that might be. And I noticed a few little messages in the chat from people saying where their stones are coming from, so that's really lovely. It's great, brilliant. Yeah, I think that's it, and we're going to press on with the evening. Welcome.
Sorry, Shona. I'm just trying technical difficulties. And here we go. So here we go. So from Ireland, hello and welcome. It's Maria, and thank you so much to Kama for bringing us in today. Delighted to be here with my Celtic candle. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake. The drowsy water rats, there we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries, and of the reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand.
Good people, pray heed our petition. Your attention we beg and request. And if you are so kind as to listen, we shall think ourselves truly blessed. We have come to relate you some stories concerning our foremothers' time. Their ready, Mr. Driver, your worries. Of that we are all of one mind. Many tales of life and death, of horror and fear may arise. There are no finer tales in our countries, Wales, Scotland or Ireland likewise. There is one mere thing to mention, our tales are all told in fun. Ah, now that I have your attention, we'll speak on to the beat of the drum. We'll speak on to the beat of the drum. Boom, boom, boom.
Old Elwyn, he was 97 years old. He'd been farming up on the top for his whole life. He'd been born in that farm, he'd been raised in that farm. He knew that farm and that hillside like the back of his hand. It was a hard life, but it was a good one. They had no running water, no electricity, but he was happy. And it had all gone so well. 97 years old, and he was still managing to keep this farm going. But in the last couple of weeks, he'd had a few turns, a few difficulties. And so it was decided that the animals would be sold off, that some of the land would be rented away, and he'd carry on when he could, living in that little house. For now, just for the next couple of weeks or so, Sian, his niece, had suggested that he came down to the village, got his strength back, had a few good meals. 2 weeks went by. Oh, thank you so much, Sian. Thank you so much for your hospitality. I've really appreciated, but it's time for me to get back up to the hill, back up to my farm. Oh, no, said Sian. You're no bother to us. You stay here just a little bit longer. 5 months went by. And at the end of 5 months, Elwyn was sick to the back teeth of it, sitting wrapped in a blanket all day long, no fresh air, meals being fed to him. He wanted to be out in the wild. He wanted to be up in the hills. So one night, it was just coming to the end of October, he waited for his niece and husband to go off to bed. He waited for the sound of the light switch. And then, quiet as a mouse, he pulled on his waxy jacket. He pulled his woolen hat down over his ears. He pulled on his old Wellington boots, and he slipped out into the night. Now, there was a storm blowing in from the east, and it was a 6-mile walk from the village back up to the top. But he knew that road like the back of his hand. He wasn't scared. He was about an hour into his journey when it started. This strange feeling came over him. All of a sudden, he didn't know if his journey had just started or if his journey had just finished. He had no idea where he was on that road. And then all of a sudden, he heard hooves. Distant at first, but they got louder and louder and louder. And then all of a sudden, he heard this squealing, this screeching in his ears. He put his hands over his ears, but it didn't seem to stop it. In fact, it seemed to make it worse. And then all of a sudden, he remembered his mother's warning. Don't go out at night, Elwyn. If you go out at night and you hear that squealing in your ears, you can be sure that it's Mastinos. Mastinos, that she-demon, that devil, come to whisk you away and take you to the other world. If you hear that screaming, run like the wind, boy. Run like the wind. Get yourself home. Don't stop for anything. But no sooner had he thought it than he felt a presence behind him. It was a woman. He could feel her breath on his face. He could feel her hair tickling him. Mastinos, he said. Mastinos, is that you? Shh. She didn't feel like a she-demon. She felt soft and kind and gentle. All of a sudden, he felt himself being lifted up off the floor. He looked down and he could see his own crumpled body. His own crumpled body lying down there in the dirt. All around him were these great big white dogs with bright red ears, the Cwm Annwn, the hounds of the other world, he thought. This is it. My day is done. And with that Mastinos, she lifted him onto the back of her horse. She climbed on herself. He wrapped his arms around her waist. She dug her bare heels into the horse's sides, and it leapt into a gallop as fast and as light as moonlight. And now the strange thing was that they found Elwyn the next day, laid out in the heather, as peaceful as they come, a smile on his face, and his body strewn with gorse flower.
We're going to leave Wales for a moment. We're going to fly up like a spark from the fire up north to my country, to Scotland. And this is the moment that if you have a stone, it might be good to go and get it. And you can show it, that would be nice. Oh yeah, stones. Oh, thanks. You can feel the weight of this stone in your hand. Can you wrap your fist around it, or is it too heavy for that? Feel the texture of this stone. Has it been worn away, or has it been freshly cut? And if you haven't got a stone, look around. Is there something around you that's made of stone? If not, why not? Are you sitting in a house made of stone? These stones, they may have been worn away by the Atlantic Ocean over thousands of years. They might have fallen off a cliff. They might have been smoothed by a small stream in the Highlands. Or they might have been man-made, cement cracked together. Each one of these stones holds the story of the whole world inside it. I want you to think for a second, the first word that comes into your head with this stone. Mine is warming. And after 3, if you'd be so kind, I'd like you to say your word just into the space. You don't have to unmute. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3.
Strong.
There's a Celtic tradition, a Scottish tradition, perhaps it's shared by other Celtic nations, that when a person dies, their spirit is trapped inside a stone. And it's kept there. It stays in there, very much at peace, waiting for as long as it'll have to wait until someone recognises it as more than a stone. Until a little child picks up and says, "That's pretty, I'll have that," and puts it in their pocket. You recognise that stone, the one that you have in your hand, as something more. That's why you brought it here. And when it's recognised as more than a stone, the spirit is released. And it can go on wherever it goes on to. So can you say your word one more time after 3? 1, 2, 3. Groshier and clear. Groshier holash. Groshier and clear. Groshier holash. Groshier and clear. Groshier holash. Veindu holash. Ars javorain. Veindu holash. Ars javorain. They say that she was made of rocks. She has many names: Mother Nature, Queen of Winter, Winter Witch, Queen of the Weather. She's called Beira, she's called Du, she's called Caliach na Beira, she's called that old hag, little bitch. I call her the Kayak. The Kayak has a hammer of power, and she uses it to smash into the landscape. She sculpts the mountains and the coastlines and the islands. She is an architect. She carved the world that we are cradled in today. She has a staff of power, and if she taps the earth, it will freeze in an instant. And if she plunges it into the earth and pulls it forth from the ground, from the hard rock, a spring will break free. And sometimes, because she's the creator of the Celtic world, she's a little tired. So she might relax on a mountainside with her hands behind her head and survey the land that she's made. And as her Mother Nature, her animals, they come to drink from the well. And she might fall asleep. And her animals will drink and then they'll disperse. And when she awakes, well, the lochs have arrived of Scotland and the lakes of Ireland and Wales. That's how they got to be there. One day, the kayak, she was standing in the Ayrshire Bay, where I'm from, disguised as a mountain, classic. And she had above her head a huge rock, a piece of granite. And she was using that rock to smash into the sea. She was making a sea storm. She invigorates things. That's her job for the life to come in the spring. She smashes it into the sea to invigorate the waves. And she didn't see, or she didn't care, because she's a giant goddess, creator deity, that there was a little boy on a wee boat coming towards her. This wee boat was no more than a wee toy. And he was being thrown about on the waves, clinging onto the mast for dear life. And he had the voice of his mammy in his head saying, I told you, Jamie, let's call him Jamie. I told you, Jamie, you are just a little boy and that is just a small boat. It's no more than a toy. And if you go out when the kayak's about, if you go out at the Samhain, you're going to get yourself in trouble. You're just a wee boy and I need you home. I'm going to die, Mammy, you were right, I should have known. This is terrible, what am I going to do? You are not going to die, says his mammy in his head. I need you home, I said, now check your pocket. And his mammy put in his back pocket a hagstone. You can get these in Ayrshire. They're a stone with a hole in it. And if you peer through that hole, anything that's magic is revealed to you. And Jamie sees that it's not a mountain he was headed towards. It's not fluffy clouds and tumbling cliffs. It's a giant woman. And her hair is the clouds and her skirt is the cliffs. And she's about to smash his wee boat with her huge granite rock. So he takes his chance and he scales the mast and he jumps through the air. And he lands on the kayak's hairy leg. And he uses the leg hairs like a ladder. And he climbs up and up. And it gets darker and darker and hairier. And let's stop there. He finishes at that tickly bit just behind the knee. Because I don't know if there's any underage people here today. And he closes his eyes and he tickles. And the kayak, she stops smashing the rock. And she drops her huge stone and it lands into the ocean. And Jamie, he falls too. She smacks him off. He lands on his little boat and he's carried back safely to the Ayrshire Bay. And when he wakes up, on the beach, in the sand dunes, covered in gorse flower, he shakes himself off. He sees that the island Ailsa Craig has arrived, Paddy's milestone. And he thinks, I've got a story to tell tonight in the pub.
I want you to come back now to Malldinos, that she-demon that carried Elwyn off as light and as fast as moonlight. Well, even she-demons were children once. They called her Malldinos because she was born in the middle of the night. And for the first few years of her life, she just kept her parents awake all the time, all night long. She was now 7 years old. She had this bright red hair and eyes that were as deep and as green as the ocean. They lived in a little commoner's dwelling on the edge of a common. It was a ramshackle little place. It was a hard life, but it was a good one. Now they'd had a good summer, they'd had a good autumn, they'd had a good harvest, and now it was Nos Calan Gaeaf, such an important part of the year. Now, common communities in those days, they used to gather for these seasonal festivals. They used to gather, the common would have been littered with all these little ramshackle little dwellings, and they would have gathered in the middle of the common, and that's what they were going to do tonight. There was a little natural amphitheatre in the middle, and all the locals had pulled all these great big branches, and they were going to have a huge, great big bonfire. They had everything ready. Malltyn North, she was wearing one of her mother's old dresses, a faded woolen red dress. She felt as smart as anything. And she'd made this mask out of twisted bits of gorse and old skulls, all tied together with bits of bracken that she'd found. Ready to scare, of course, you would be to scare away the bad demons, or at least hope that those bad spirits would pass on by. But this was a time for celebrating. It was a time for celebrating, bringing some of that light and warmth, of remembering the ancestors. But it was, of course, a time where that veil was thin and bad things also roamed the earth. So they made their way across the common. They had this big bowl of soup. They had 2 great big flagons of wine. And as the sun came down, they lit the bonfire, and it exploded into this brilliant hot fire. And there was chanting, and there was singing, and there was rituals, and there was dancing. And it went on for 4 or 5 hours, and eventually that fire, it burnt down to just embers. Come on, children. It was 9. Gather round. Well, she wasn't really their 9. She wasn't any of their 9s. But everybody called her that. They all thought she must be at least 200 years old, because she seemed to have 1,000 wrinkles and these little eyes that twinkled like stars. But she was the most incredible storyteller. Gather round. The veil is very thin, children. Spirits roam the earth. Our ancestors roamed the earth, and with that, the names of her ancestors tumbled off her tongue. The names of all the commoners' ancestors tumbled off her tongue. Gwyn ap Nudd is out tonight. Gwyn ap Nudd, the king of Annwn, the ruler of the Tylwyth Teg, the big, wild stranger on his great black horse, and he's gathering up those souls and he's taking them back down to Annwn. And she told them stories of the Tylwyth Teg and of Lady Wen. The stories, they went on and on and on until that fire, it began to get really low now. Ah, children, it's nearly time for the Hoch the Gutter to come. No, shouted the children, not the Hoch the Gutter, please, not the Hoch the Gutter night, please, not tonight. The Hoch the Gutter. She's paroling that veil between this world and that. She's looking for a thin spot to push her way through. The Hoch the Gutter, the great giant pig. She's 5 times as big as a normal pig. Her skin is black. She has wires growing out of her. She has great big tusks and eyes like demons. And she's trying to push her way through. I can feel it. She's through. She's through. She's near us now. Her great nose is sniffing. She's hungry. She's hungry for children. You've got to get home, children. Do you have your stones? Yes, shouted the children. Yes, we've got our stones. And they got them out. Now, there was this tradition that they would take a stone and they would write their name onto this stone. And then they would put that stone into the fire, and they would hope and they would pray that their stone was still there the next day. Because if it was gone, and it was a horrible thing, really, if it was gone, it was said that that child would be dead within the year. So these poor, solemn little children sadly make their way to the fire and toss in their stones. Everyone except Malltyn North. There was absolutely no way that she was throwing her stone into the fire only to be whisked away within the next year. Oh no. So she pretended to throw it in, and then, sly as a fox, she slipped it safe into her pocket. What are you waiting for? Shouted 9. Run! The Hoch the Gutter's coming now! Run like the wind! And you can imagine these poor little children, their little legs running as fast as they can. They can barely get breath into their lungs, their little hearts beating like a drum. Now Macht, she had to go with her two brothers, and between them they just had one lantern. Now these poor children, they were terrified, they were petrified. All they could think about is getting those legs running as fast as they could, getting home to their houses as quickly as they could, each for their own. Now it was hard that night. It was hard to run because there was a mist, a thick, horrible mist. Poor Macht could barely even see her own hands. And those boys, their legs were so much longer, they were so much older than her. They could run faster, but she could hear it. If she listened, she could hear their feet running ahead. She could hear their breath, if she could just keep up with the sound. But slowly that sound, it drifted away. It got further and further and further until she was in silence. She could hear nothing. She could see nothing. Gwen! Matthew! She didn't want to shout too loud because she didn't want the Huchty Gutter to hear her. Gwen! Matthew! Wait for me, Gwen! Matthew! Nothing came back. Gwen! Matthew, please, I'm lost. Nothing. And then she sighed a huge sigh of relief. There in the distance, she could see a light. It was her brother's light. Gwen, Matthew, wait for me. Oh, she ran again. She ran faster than she'd ever run before towards this light now. She ran and 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 she ran until suddenly she found herself up to her knees in bog. She'd run into the common bog. But this was no ordinary bog. It was like standard bog, mostly. But within it, there were these huge, great, big black pools. And if you were to fall into one of those pools, the earth would suck you down into it and you would never be seen again. Each year, her father lost several sheep in those bogs. She couldn't see in front of her. How did she know that the next step wasn't going to send her straight down into the blackness? She went down onto her hands and knees. I'll spread my weight. And inch by inch, she felt her way forward. That light still in front of her. She couldn't lose the light. Now, the two brothers, of course, they'd arrived home. They'd expected Macht to be not far behind, but she didn't come. And she didn't come. And she didn't come. They didn't want to go back out into the night. They didn't want to go back out there to the Huchty Gutter, but they couldn't leave their little sister all on her own. They took each other's hands, they lifted the latch of the gate, and they went out onto the hill and they searched. And they searched and they searched, and eventually they found themselves back at the fire. All the adults were there. They were drunk as anything. Has Macht come back here? They fell silent. They had been drunk. They were sober in an instant. It was like a military operation. They went off 2 by 2, each searching and searching and searching and searching and searching. But it wasn't easy with that thick fog. It came through to daylight and they still hadn't found her. They searched the whole of that day, and the next night they still couldn't find her. They were exhausted. And as the sun came up the next day, it was Gwilym from over the hill, he found it on the edge of the bog. The only sign of Macht Dinos. That stone, perfectly heavy and smooth, with Macht Dinos carefully carved into the top of it. And almost as soon as he picked up that stone, the fog, it seemed to get thicker and thicker, and it filled poor Gwilym's lungs with grief.
The Samhain mists. It's as if they have a noise of their own as they curl up from the River Lee. Michal grew up on those stories of the curling Samhain mists and how the veil thins at that time of the year, at Samhain time. But now it was 2020. He was a young man working for himself, And his mother was calling to him as he went out the door. "Oh God, Micheál, and you have to go out tonight. You have to go out. It's Samhain, and the veils are thinning. And tomorrow it's the 1st of November. It's the Day of the Dead. It's when we write our lists." And he left her there, her words ringing in his ears as he called over his shoulder, "That's for a different century, ma'am. That's for a different century." But as he went out, it became more difficult to ignore her words, because the fog and the mist was thickening, and he could see shapes appearing and disappearing in its midst. And it had a kind of a yellow glow, this mist, and it felt magical. And he made his way down from the top of Cork's hills, down towards Collins's barracks, the old Victorian limestone barracks. It always looked as if it was hiding some haunting. He passed it with his hand up to his eye, and then down past Bell's Field to the top of the Fever Hospital steps. There he saw the shapes more solidly forming and disappearing, until a face came out of the mist, became as solid as you or I. He looked into the dark, sorrowful eyes of this man with his hollowed out cheeks. Without speaking, he was invited to look down. And there, in the man's hands, was a little box. Without asking, Micheál felt drawn to go over to the box and pull aside a little piece of cloth. And in the box, he saw the reason for the sorrow in the man's eyes, for there was a little baby. Without speaking, Micheál invited him to put the box down on the back of his bicycle. He laid it down as if it was a great weight, although Micheál thought there couldn't have been much weight in it at all. And then the man, taking the lead, made a slow descent down the Fever Hospital steps as the mists of the Lee curled up, and Micheál followed him, falling into step at a funeral pace. At the bottom of the steps, they began taking the windy roads of Cork, behind Murphy's Brewery, down the narrow lane, up the narrow steps towards the top of Shandon Street, and there they turned left. But this wasn't like any Shandon Street that Micheál could remember. There was no electric lights, there was no cars, not one, and the silence had a sound of its own. Down they went, down to the end of Shandon Street, and then they turned left into a little graveyard. Micheál was thinking to himself, surely this doesn't exist anymore. Wasn't this tarred over to make a car park? And then he realised this was not a time for those thoughts. The man was going from grave to grave as if he was searching, and then he found a new grave. Gratefully, he went to the foot of the grave, and with his bare hands, he dug out a little hole. Then he put his hands up to Micheál. Micheál took the box, hardly any weight in it, and handed it to the man. He placed it so carefully into that little hole and covered it over as if he was putting soft blankets there. And then he looked at Micheál, and in the old tongue, he began the prayers. Arnahir atarnaf, go nefer danum, go dagad richt, go neintr da holler and halav mar a neintr naf. And Micheál, he answered them. He found himself remembering the old prayers and answering along. At the end, the man looked at him, such gratitude in his eyes. And Michal, he felt like a fraud, and he felt grateful, and he felt afraid. And the mists began to get thicker and thicker, and the man's face disappeared into the mist. And Michal found the fear clutching at his heart and working its way up through his throat and into his legs. And he ran from that place with his bicycle straight down the hill towards the River Lee. And he saw the mists were returning now, returning to the water. And then he saw the lights of a bus, and he heard the bustle of his own city. Oh, thank God, he said. And he would never again treat the mists of Samhain with disrespect. And he would always listen to his mother's words when she said, "Oh, be careful, it's Samhain and the veil is thinning."
I want you to come back to our little common, our little cottage, to Matt's mother and father and two brothers in that house that's full of the loss of poor little Matt. They searched and they searched for a few more weeks after her disappearance, but nothing. It was as though she'd just disappeared off the face of the earth. Before long, Nos Calan Gaeaf came round again, but there was no celebration up on the hill. No, it became a time of mourning. A time of mourning for Matt Dinos. The years skipped by, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And then on the 7th year, Matt's mother and father and two brothers, they were asleep by the fire in the way that they used to. And it was just on the cusp between Nos Calan Gaeaf and Calan Gaeaf itself, right on the strike of midnight, there was a knock on the door. Matt's mother, she sat upright. She pulled a blanket around herself. She climbed out of bed. She went to the door. She opened the latch. She took a deep breath and she pulled the door open, just a crack. And there on the doorstep was a girl on the cusp of womanhood. Her hair was bright red. Her eyes were as green as the ocean. She wore a red faded dress that came up to her knees, pulled tight across her growing chest. Matt Dinos. The family threw themselves around her and they sobbed and they sobbed and they sobbed. And then they looked at her. Matt, they said, "Where have you been?" "I don't know." "Well, don't worry about it now," said her mother. And with that, she dressed her in an old nightshirt of hers. She wrapped her in blankets. She placed her daughter's head in her lap. She stroked her hair and she sang her songs from her childhood. When the family woke up the next morning, Matt was up and ready. "I help you," she said. No, said her mother. "You stay here, you need to rest. I help you." And with that, she determined to go up onto the top of the hill with her father and her two brothers. And she worked those sheep like they had never seen. It was as though they could hear her thoughts and she could hear their thoughts. She could do the work of 3 boys of her own age. And then she came back that night and she helped her mother scrub the floor and cook the meals. But she only ever said 3 words at the most. And then sometimes she would disappear out into the wilderness and she would come back with this brace of rabbits and fresh fish that she caught from the river. It was amazing. Now, everyone on the common, they were delighted with her return. "Ah, it's our little miracle child," they would see every time that they saw her. "Beautiful Matt Dinos, how pleased we are that you are home." But the people in the village, they weren't so sure. It had been noted that the people on the common kept little bundles of herbs and hung them up in strange ways. They found little skulls hanging around the place in odd little ways. A few people had heard of strange commotions going on up in that hill, and they were sure that those people were clinging on to their pagan ways. And when Math disappeared and reappeared in the way she did and the way she acted so strangely, gossip began to spread through the village of witchcraft, of devilry. By the time Math was 19 years old, she was beautiful. You can imagine, with her bright red hair, freckles tickling her nose, her eyes as deep and as green as the ocean. Now, all the boys were madly in love with her, but they didn't know how to talk to her because she could only say 3 words at a time. And the girls were all madly jealous. It was a May Day afternoon, and there was a knock on the little cottage door. Math's mother opened the door, and there on the doorstep stood Mrs. Jones. She was a tiny little woman with her face turned into a scowl constantly. She held her hands tightly at her chest, so tight it seemed as though she was trying to pull her own hands off. "Oh, Mrs. Jones, how nice to see you. Won't you come in?" She made Mrs. Jones a nice cup of tea and a bite to eat, and once the pleasantries were done with, "Now, it's time to get on with business," said Mrs. Jones. "We've had a few little meetings in the village with the vicar as well, and we've got to be honest, we've got a few concerns about your daughter. A few of us are scared that maybe the devil has got inside her. I'm sure you're going to have to, I'm sure you'll understand that we've got to get it out." Now, Math's mother was scared. The drovers quite often passed through that little farm, and they heard stories that came from London and Europe about girls being burned for much less than what Math had done. And so the wedding was arranged. Mrs. Jones arranged for the vicar's son to marry Math. What better person to get rid of that devil? A little ceremony was held in the little chapel. Now, the vicar's son was 6 foot tall, but he stood at about 5'7" because he was so hunched over. And he had this black hair, thick, black, greasy hair that came down to about here, and these great big bushy eyebrows, and this very disconcerting habit of staring you, of pinning you with his eyes while he was talking to you. But he was to be the one that she would marry. They were to live in the village. Mrs. Jones had kindly said that she would come and teach Math the good craft of conversation. She would learn the ways of a woman. There would be no more wildness. There would be no going out onto the hill hunting for this and that. The priest would come each day and he would pray for her soul. Math would pray herself for 2 or 3 hours a day. But Math, within weeks, was miserable. She longed to be out on the hill, out in the wild, free. By the time 5 months had gone by, poor Math, she was a shadow of her former self. She was barely eating. She had dark rings underneath her eyes. She had begged her husband to let her go back to the hill just for a bit, but he wouldn't have any of it. It was just coming up to the end of October. She heard her husband going out the door. She pulled her coat on. She pulled a hat down over her ears. She opened the back door and she slipped out into the night. She ran as fast as the wind through the forest. She found a little path that led up onto the top of the hill, and she climbed up, 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 up. She'd been walking for about an hour when it happened. This strange feeling came over her. Like she knew that hill like the back of her hand, but all of a sudden she didn't know if her journey had just started or if her journey was finishing or where she was. She was just coming up to the crossing of 2 sheep paths. And then she heard it. The sound of hooves. They were very distant, but they got louder and louder and louder. It sounded like a huge, great big horse. And then all of a sudden she heard this sort of shrieking, growling. It was deep. It was so deep it shook her bones. She put her hands over her ears, but it made no difference. It was as though it almost made it worse. And then all of a sudden she could hear Nine's voice in her head. "Don't go out at night," she said. "Don't go out at night, children, not ever, not on your own." And if you do, if you hear that growling, if you hear that deep sound in your bones, you run like the wind. You run like the wind. You don't let anything stop you. But no sooner had she thought it than she felt a presence behind her. It was the presence of a man. She could feel his breath on her cheeks. She could feel his beard on her neck. Gwynap Neath, she said, is that you? She turned and she looked at him. In his hands he held 2 ropes. On the ends of those 2 ropes were 2 horses. The finest horses that she had ever seen. One was as black as the night, one was white as the moon. You don't belong here, said Gwynap Neath. You're wild. I want you to come with me, if you will. I want you to come with me and join the wild hunt. I want you to gallop the mountains and the forests and the wild places. And I want you to help me gather up the poor souls of the lost and carry them safe down to Annwn. She agreed in an instant. She turned to the white horse. She touched its face. She grabbed its mane with 2 of her hands and, like a cat, she leapt up onto the back of that horse. She dug her bare heels into that horse, and together, she and Gwynap Neath, they galloped off into the horizon as light and as fast as moonlight. They found Malltyn North the next day, laid out on the heather. She seemed to have a smile across her face, and across her body were strewn gorse flowers.
We are married in a home. Oh, as some hina hooke hoi. Oh, you are oh, you go. Oh, you are oh, you hooty, you are oh, who go. Oh, you are oh, you hooty, you are oh, who go.
Away with us she's going, the solemn eyes. She'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillsides, or the kettle on the hob, sing peace into her breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For she comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, from a world more full of weeping than she can understand.
Go light the lantern at your door and honor those who have gone before. The worlds that part us now are twain, for Hallows Eve is here again. The westering sun grows pale and wan, the days grow dark, the nights draw in, the autumn leaves are tint with fire, fruit hangs ripe upon the briar. Go light the lantern at your door and honor those who have gone before. The worlds that part us now are twain, for Hallows Eve is here again. Sweep out the hearth and clear the grate, and bid fond welcome at your gate. Gather the final harvest in, for all the hardship winter brings. Go light the lantern at your door and honor those who have gone before. The worlds that part us now are twain, for Hallows Eve is here again. Between the bonfires lightly tread, and bless the year that lies ahead. The seasons turn to frost and dew, before the sun its strength renews. Go light the lantern at your door, and honour those who've gone before. The worlds that part us now are twain, for Hallows Eve is here again. Go light the lantern at your door, honour those who've gone before. The worlds that part us now are twain, for Hallows Eve is here again.
Woohoo! Thank you so much, Rihanna. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect thing for this evening. Thank you. That was lovely. That was gorgeous. And let's have Shona next. Lovely. Thanks, Shona.
Thanks everyone. So this story, I don't know how old it is, but it's pretty new to me. And there's no children here, is there? Oh, I can swear. Great. So this story begins in a bar, and it begins with a guy called Paddy. Because there's always a guy called Paddy, isn't there, Kiva?
There is.
There's always a guy called Paddy. And Paddy, he is currently ducking and diving around this busy bar on Halloween because he has promised 5 individual women that he's going to marry them. And in exchange, you know what happened in exchange. So he's being chased by 5 individual women, and he's swiping drinks off tables left and right as he goes ducking and diving until, of course, the candles burn low and he's a bit too drunk to be able to avoid them anymore. And they corner him and they say, "Paddy, I thought you were going to marry me." "No, Paddy, you said you'd marry me." And he says, "Listen, ladies, I'll marry all of you." And they say, "No, you're a ball bag." Splash, straight in his face with some whiskey. He says, "Okay, ladies, I promise, I'll marry." I'll tell you what will happen, right? I'll marry the lady. Remember old Nick? Oh, old Nick was a bastard. I hated that guy. He was so sleazy. Remember old Nick at his funeral last month? I had an elder branch. Oh, someone's signing off because of the swearing. Sorry, Anna. I had an elder branch, probably not, that I dropped in Nick's grave by accident when we were burying him. Whoever goes to get my elder branch, I'll whittle that into a spoon, a wedding spoon, and I will marry that woman. How do you fancy that, ladies? And of course, they all turned and left him. Goodbye! But there was one lassie in the corner, Kate, and she was interested, and she'd always had a shine for Paddy, and Paddy'd always had a shine for her, but because of probably abandonment issues or who knows what, they never quite got it together. And Kate came up to Paddy and she says, "I'll do that, Paddy. I'll find that stick. I'm not scared of any man." And he said, "No, Kate, are you crazy? It's Halloween. I was just trying to get them off my back. You can't do that." And she says, "I'll do that. Is it true? Did you drop your stick?" And he said, "Aye, I dropped my stick, but don't do that. See you tomorrow though, eh?" So that night, everyone goes to bed and Kate decides that she is going to find this stick. She goes to the graveyard. It's past midnight. It's a full moon like it was this year, which is so weird, right? And she begins to dig at old Nick's grave. And there's no one around. And the trees, they're scratching against each other. But she's not scared. She's fine. She carries on digging. And she hears something creaking in the background. There's a wolf or a fox or whatever, maybe a hedgehog. She's fine. She keeps on digging until she hears a, "Lassie, I'm hungry." And out from the grave comes 2 bony fingers, and they grab her face and they pull her in close. And out from the grave comes a bony face, his eyes gone, no eyeballs. "Lassie, I'm hungry." And he pulls himself out of the grave, holding onto her shoulders, and he throws himself, this skeletal Nick, onto her back. "Lassie, I'm hungry," he whispers in her ear, and she can't move for fear, and he says, "Go, go." And so she begins to walk. "But where shall I go, skeleton?" And he says, "Take me to food." And the nearest house is Paddy's house. There, in there. And in the door they go. And Paddy's asleep, he's passed out, he is past it, he's had too much to drink. And she quietly opens the cupboard doors and she finds some oatmeal, fine. And she looks for some milk. There's no milk. He's a bachelor, can't he look after himself? There's not even a water pail. I'm sorry, Skeleton, I can't make you food. And he says, wait. And he takes a bowl from the side and he takes a knife from the side and he drags himself into the room where Paddy is sleeping. And then he drags himself out of the room where Paddy is sleeping and the bowl is full. Cook, he says. And she begins to, as she cries, stir this blood into the oatmeal, into the porridge, and she makes a porridge mulch. Here. And he sits and he eats. And he says, you eat too. And he gives her a spoon. And she pretends to eat it, but in fact she drops it into her apron. Eat! And he tries to feed her again. And together, in this weird duet, the two of them finish this bowl of oats and porridge. And he says, I'm done. I'm satisfied. Take me. And so she takes him back on her back and she leaves Paddy's house. And as they're walking through the quiet streets, he says, thank you, lass. Not many would have done that. And here, for your generosity, I'll tell you something. Before I died, I buried some gold up near Robertson's field. And she said, thank you, Skeleton. But it's a shame that poor lad had to die for you to be satisfied for one last meal. And he says, aye, that is a shame. But if you had kept one morsel of that gunk, that bloody mess, if you'd spoon that into his dead mouth by tomorrow evening, he'll survive. So she places him back in the grave, she covers him up and she runs for her life. She runs for her life home. And in the morning, she's woken by her mother who's saying, you boy, Paddy, I thought you'd be married. I always thought you were so well together. I don't know why that never happened. He's died. And she says, wasn't he me? I don't know why you're blaming me. Get in my face, Mum. And she goes to the church where Paddy's lying in wake and she says to his father, who's mourning the body, Paddy's father, Bobby, I love your son. If there's anything I could do, if I could have done to bring him back, could I be your daughter-in-law? Could we be married? And Bobby, Paddy's daddy, he says, aye, lassie, if there's anything anyone could do, they could have whatever they wanted from me. And so she goes to where Paddy's sleeping and she opens her stiff mouth and she spoons in a bit of the oatmeal gunk that she'd hidden in her apron. And his eyes pop open and his cheeks flush and she snogs his face off and they get married. And of course, after a year, she shows him where the gold is. And of course, a few years after that, they have a couple of babies because that's what happens. And they build a castle and it's all beautiful. And that's the end of that.
Brilliant. Oh, Shona, so funny and brilliant and great and horrible. Loved it. Thank you so much. Yay. Brilliant. And now Gordon.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Cool. Okay, so this is a very old Irish-Scottish mixed story about Bera, the Queen of Winter, who we heard about before in the first half. And it's about love and all that sort of stuff. So it starts off as Bera was, as we had established, the Queen of Winter and the creator of Scotland. And she walked around with her magic hammer and hammered out the mountains and did a lot of other adventurous type things. But then she was kind of finished and she was a bit tired and she decided that she wanted to get herself someone to live with. So she looked around all the place and said, well, there's all these giants around and maybe I could go and have some sort of relationship with a large dragon or something. You know, I'm a goddess. What am I going to do? But then she saw someone that would really take her fancy. High up in the air, wandering around, beautiful as the sun, beautiful as the air, was the goddess, Breed. And Breed was beautiful, so beautiful, everyone would look into the stars and think of her. She was eternal and she was youthful and she was just so beautiful. And Bera decided that she wanted to marry her. And so she courted her. by standing at the top of all the mountains and shouting out loud and creating loud storms and saying, "Oi, up there, breed, come down here, I want to marry you." And she did all the things that you wanted. She created herself a large stone, and she said, "This is my heart stone, breed, I'll give it to you." And then she picked up a large spoon and said, "This is my wedding spoon, I'll give you a wedding spoon if you only marry me." And eventually Breed looked down and said, "Yeah, that sounds good." And she floated down and they got married and they had a lovely time of it. They just spent all their time together wandering around Scotland feeling happy. But then it turned out that Bera also had some sort of issues to do with winter. She was like, I'm feeling a bit warm. I want to create a winter over the land. So she started to throw snow about and bring up storms. And she was having a great old time. Breed was not quite as excited about this. And she would say, "Oh, my love, this is nice that you're creating a winter and it does look beautiful. Like I see your artistry, but the people are suffering. And I feel really sad about that." And Bera, the Queen of Winter, said, "They're just little people. I don't really care. So look at how beautiful the snow is. Have you checked out the Grampians lately? They're amazing." Well, this went on for a while. They had a bit of an argument, and eventually Breed said, "It's too much. You're too into your work. You're spending all your time on winter. I'm leaving you." She left in a huff. Bera said, "Well, fine. I'm just going to go into my work more." And she started banging away and creating more winter, and it got worse and worse and worse until eventually she was exhausted. She felt old and haggard. She was the Cailleach. She was the old hag who said, "Oh, I've spent all my work on winter, and what do I have to show for it? Just a lot of miserable people." So at this point, the summer was starting to appear. And Bera was feeling really sad and really miserable. She didn't have her wife anymore. So she decided, "I've had enough of this. I'm leaving. I'm going to go somewhere else." And she left. She decided that because she was so old, she would prefer to be really, really young. And her way of being young was to travel far over to the west. She went down towards Ireland, and she went down to Cove, near where the River Lee is. And she found herself a white horse that was able to sail across the sea. And she picked up 7 of the rivers of Ireland and wrapped them around herself, because the scarf of the river would protect her. And she jumped onto a horse, and she galloped over to the west to the land of Tir na Og, where she would meet Manannán mac Lir, the Lord of the Sea. Now, she'd had dealings with the Lord of the Sea before. Many years before, a small boy had crawled up her and tickled her knee, and she dropped a big rock on Manannán mac Lir's head. Manannán was very upset by this, but they got chatting and they got to know each other. So they had a bit of a kinship. And she came to Manannán and said, I'm very old and I'm very weak and I'd like to be young again." And Manannán mac Lir happened to have some apples on a silver branch and said, "Take one of these, you'll be youthful again, and then you can do anything you want." So she ate the apple and was transformed, youthful again. She felt, this is brilliant. I'm heading back to Scotland. I'm going to find Breed and everything will be wonderful. She galloped back, got to Scotland, and there, she saw the most terrible thing. For the King of Summer, Angus, was walking around and had married Breed. She was heartbroken. She couldn't bear to see them so happy. She looked at her heartstone and she just played with it so much, and eventually she grew a bit sad and angry. She burned with her finger a hole through that stone and dropped it onto the beaches of Ayrshire. You can still see them there today. She was heartbroken and said, "I'm going to go somewhere where none of this sorrow will affect me." She said, "I'm going to go to the happiest lands in the world." And so she went south to somewhere warmer and nice with good weather. And she arrived on a common near a bog. It's quite a dodgy bog. It had strange, dark things in it. There was all sorts of people there who looked a bit suspicious. And she sat there and said, "Here I'm going to sit being miserable. I'm not going to be happy." But as she sat, a mist appeared and swirled around her. And she started to hear the clip-clop of hooves, but deep hooves. And then she started to hear a breath. And as she turned over her shoulder, she saw a wild hunt. Many, many creatures from an underworld. And one of them, a dark queen, said to her, "You look a bit sad." She said, "Oh, I'm mourning my loss of my love." She said, "Come on the hunt with us. You'll have a grand old time. We'll have a bit of crack. You'll love it." And so Bera joined the wild hunt, and they ran around all over the place, having a great old time. And they'd ferry people to the afterworld, and they would hunt strange things. And she generally felt, this is great. And the seasons turned. And eventually it was autumn, and the leaves were falling from the trees. And she felt the need to visit Scotland again. And when she visited this time, and she got there, it turned out that Angus was dying. The summer was over, and he was just ready to slip on into the other world. And there she met Breed, and Breed was crying. Bera went up to Breed and said, "Oh, I see you found another person to marry." And Breed said, "Yeah, but I mean, he was nice and all, you know, he's very bright and friendly and warm, but he really, like you, got into his job of being summer and kind of ignored me at the end. It was all just harvest this, harvest that. Kind of done with him now." Bera said, "Would you have me back?" Breed said, "Maybe." "Would you still be really into your work of winter?" And Bera said, I would actually. I kind of have to do it every year." And Breed thought about this, and she thought about all the happiness of the world and how that the happiness of the world would be destroyed by winter. But then it would be rather beautiful. And she could spend her time up in the high places. And frankly, the people had been very annoying during the summer as well. They'd given them great bounty and they were still complaining about stuff. So she said, "You know what? Yes, I will. I'll return to you, Bera. We can be married again. We can usher in the winter. And on this night, when the veils are thin, we can send old Angus over to the other world and he can come back in 6 months. But as for us, we can spend the rest of this year together." The end.
Oh, that was gorgeous, Gordon. Thank you so much. And we couldn't have had a more perfect and brilliant story to follow on from our first half. And it pulled in so many of the aspects of all of our stories in the first half. That was gorgeous. Thank you so much. That was great. Woo!
I spent it in good company, and all the harm that ever I've done, alas, it was all done to me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill me to the parting glass. Good night and joy be with ye all. Good night and joy be with you all.
Oh, lovely, gorgeous. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, two wonderful Celtic cousins. Thank you, everybody who's kind of contributed their songs and stories this evening.